What if Beauty and the Beast was never really a story about a woman falling in love with a monster? What if the Beast was never simply the villain of the story at all? Beneath the enchanted castle, the magical rose, and the familiar love story lies something far older and perhaps far more interesting than any of us have realised. It's a story about the parts of ourselves that we hide away, the wounds that distort us, the masks that we wear, and what can happen when something rejected is finally brought back into the light. And strangely enough, versions of this story have been appearing for thousands of years. Long before Disney gave us Belle dancing through an enchanted castle, an ancient Roman writer named Apuleius recorded the story of a beautiful young woman called Psyche, who was taken away to a mysterious palace where she became the bride of an unseen supernatural being. That story was Cupid and Psyche. And once you place these two stories beside one another, something fascinating begins to emerge. Because perhaps beauty isn't simply learning how to love the beast. Maybe beauty is meeting the beast within. And that could be why this strange fairy tale has survived for so long. Most of us know Beauty and the Beast through Disney. And for me, this story has always been especially personal. Because growing up, Beauty and the Beast was my absolute favourite Disney movie. Back when we had videos, I would rewind it and watch the movie over and over again. I think a big part of the reason was because of Belle. Even as a child, I felt like I really understood her. She was the unusual woman in the village, intelligent, curious, endlessly drawn to books, and somehow never quite satisfied with simply accepting the life everyone around her expected to live. And I related to that so deeply. I always felt a little different from other people. I loved disappearing into books and getting completely lost inside other worlds. And I had this enormous curiosity about life, asking questions other people didn't even think about. Wondering what else might exist beyond the world that we could see. What else was there to discover? And whether there might be more to life than simply following the path society seemed to lay out for everyone. And even when I was young, I had this strong feeling that I didn't want to live my life simply because it was the life I was expected to live. So when Belle sang about wanting adventure, wanting something more, and feeling as though she didn't quite belong in the world around her, there was something about her that felt incredibly familiar to me. I think this is one of the reasons why this story has stayed with me for so long, and is another reason why I've always loved Belle. She begins the story already looking beyond appearances. She didn't only see what was obvious, she looked for what was underneath. She looks beyond the boundaries of her village and beyond what society tells her she should want. And eventually, she'll be asked to look beyond something much more frightening when her father becomes lost and discovers an enchanted castle belonging to the terrifying beast. Belle eventually takes her father's place as the beast's prisoner, and slowly something begins to change. The creature who initially appears angry, frightening, and almost incapable of tenderness begins revealing another side of himself. Belle discovers that beneath the claws, the temper, and the monstrous appearance is someone capable of vulnerability, generosity, and love. And eventually, when she loves him for who he has become rather than what he appears to be, the curse is broken. The beast becomes human again. But this story existed long before Disney, and once we begin looking beneath the familiar Disney version, we discover that Beauty and the Beast is much older than the story many of us grew up with. And the deeper we go, the stranger and more symbolic the story becomes. One of the earliest famous literary versions was published in France in 1740 by Gabrielle Suzanne Barbeau de Villeneuve. Jean-Marie Le Prince de Beaumont later shortened and reshaped the story in 1756, and it was Beaumont's much simpler version that became the foundation for many of the retellings that followed. And in that earlier fairy tale, there is one tiny object that becomes incredibly important: a rose. Beauty's father asks his children what gifts they would like him to bring home for them. Her sisters request expensive things, but Beauty only asks for a rose. And while travelling home, her father discovers the beast's mysterious castle. When he takes a rose from the garden for Beauty, the beast appears. Suddenly, the rose becomes the object that sets the entire story in motion. Beauty eventually enters the castle herself, and each evening the beast asks her to marry him. Again and again she refuses. Yet gradually she begins to see beyond his appearance, and this detail matters. Because Beauty is not supposed to love the beast simply because he demands it. She must choose. That choice becomes central to the transformation. And when Beauty finally recognizes what exists beneath the frightening exterior, the beast becomes something else entirely. Which brings us to an ancient story that looks strangely familiar. Almost 16 centuries before Beaumont's version of Beauty and the Beast, the Roman writer Apelles included a story called Cupid and Psyche in his work Metamorphosis, also known as the Golden Ass. The surviving literary version dates from the 2nd century AD, although images of Eros and Psyche existed centuries earlier. Psyche is a mortal woman of extraordinary beauty, so beautiful in fact that people begin comparing her to the goddess Venus. Venus becomes furious and commands her son Cupid to punish Psyche. But Cupid accidentally falls in love with her himself. Eventually, Psyche is carried away to a mysterious palace where invisible servants attend to her every need. And every night a mysterious husband comes to her. There is only one condition: she must never look at him. She cannot know who he truly is. And for a time, Psyche accepts this strange arrangement. But eventually, doubt enters her mind. Her sisters convince her that perhaps the invisible husband she sleeps beside every night is actually some terrible monster. So one evening, Psyche lights an oil lamp while he sleeps. But instead of discovering a monster, she discovers Cupid, the god of love himself. And in that moment, everything changes. Cupid awakens and leaves her, and Psyche must undergo a series of extraordinary trials before the lovers can finally be reunited. Now, there are obvious differences between Cupid and Psyche and Beauty and the Beast, and scholars have cautioned against pretending the two stories communicate exactly the same worldview. But the resemblance between the story patterns has long been recognised. A young woman enters a mysterious union with a frightening or unknown supernatural bridegroom. Appearances conceal identity. Separation occurs. Trials follow, and eventually transformation and reunion become possible. And this is a pattern that appears again and again in folklore. Because maybe the frightening bridegroom isn't really about monsters, but maybe he represents an encounter with the unknown. This is where Carl Jung gives us another fascinating way of looking at the story. Jung believed that human beings contain aspects of themselves that don't fit comfortably with the identity they consciously want to possess. So perhaps I want to believe that I'm always kind, that I'm generous and spiritual and patient and loving. But somewhere beneath that identity also lives anger, jealousy, selfishness, fear, control, shame, grief, desire. Maybe even some kind of power that I've been afraid to express. Jungian psychology came to describe this hidden territory as the shadow. Elements of ourselves that the conscious personality rejects, suppresses, or refuses to recognize. And the shadow isn't necessarily composed only of the things that we see as morally bad. It may also contain undeveloped qualities and capacities we've learned not to express. So suddenly the beast becomes very interesting. Because what is a beast? It is human nature stripped of civilization, living based in instinct, rage, desire, and animality, the part of ourselves that we would rather keep hidden behind the castle walls. And where does that beast live? In isolation, inside an enormous enchanted castle separated from the ordinary world. Symbolically, this is almost exactly where we place our own rejected qualities. We hide them, we lock them away, we don't show them to the world because we decide that they are unacceptable. And then we build an identity around everything we believe ourselves to be instead. What we believe will be accepted by society. But the strange thing about the shadow is that hiding it doesn't make it disappear. It simply means that we stop recognizing it as ours. And when that happens, we actually start seeing it everywhere else. We become intensely irritated or triggered by qualities in other people that we cannot admit exist within ourselves. We judge others. We project what we don't like about ourselves onto them. We divide the world into black and white, good and bad, light and dark, spiritual and unspiritual. And perhaps this is one of the reasons fairy tales so often gives us monsters. The monster carries everything the hero doesn't yet know how to face. But Beauty and the Beast does something unusual that doesn't normally happen in fairy tales. It doesn't kill the monster, it transforms him. Think about how different this is from many traditional heroic stories. A dragon appears and the hero kills the dragon. A monster threatens the kingdom, the warrior destroys the monster. An evil witch casts a spell, and then the hero destroys the witch. Order is restored because darkness has been defeated. But that isn't what happens here. Beauty doesn't enter the castle carrying a sword. She doesn't defeat the beast. And she doesn't pretend that his behaviour is acceptable either, because it certainly isn't. Instead, gradually, relationship makes something visible. Beauty begins seeing what exists beneath the beast's surface, while the beast is forced to encounter aspects of himself that have almost disappeared. His tenderness and vulnerability, his patience and generosity, his sacrifice, and his love. This distinction is incredibly important because I don't think the spiritual message of this story should ever be reduced to if you love someone enough, you can change them. That advice can become dangerous very quickly. Love does not require us to tolerate cruelty, abuse, or unsafe relationships. And another person's healing is never our responsibility, it is theirs. But symbolically, the story can tell us something entirely different. When we stop declaring war on rejected parts of ourselves, those parts can begin to change. We can bring them to the light. They can be loved and accepted, and they can be healed. The beast does not need to be destroyed. The beast inside of you does not need to be destroyed. He needs to become conscious. And perhaps this is what shadow integration really asks of us. Not to indulge every impulse, not to become the beast, but be willing to recognize him. Because what we cannot acknowledge within ourselves can quietly control us from the darkness. What we can see clearly, however, can begin to transform. And then we have the other half of the story. Beauty herself. Why is she called Beauty? On the surface, the answer seems obvious, because she's beautiful. But fairy tales often name characters according to their symbolic role. Beauty represents something the beast cannot recognize within himself. Grace, gentleness, consciousness, compassion. Perhaps even the human soul's ability to perceive something deeper than surface appearance. And beauty has a quality that appears again and again in these stories. She sees what others cannot. Everyone else sees a monster, but beauty gradually sees a human being. Everyone else sees something terrifying, but beauty becomes curious about what lies underneath. And that is a profoundly different kind of sight. Because we tend to imagine that spiritual awakening is gaining some kind of extraordinary ability to see angels or energies or invisible worlds. But perhaps another form of awakening is much simpler. Maybe it is learning to see beyond appearances, beyond someone's status, or their beauty, or their ugliness, their persona, beyond our projections, and sometimes beyond the identity we have created for ourselves. Because if the beast represents the rejected self, beauty represents the consciousness capable of looking directly at that self without turning away and denying it. Then there is the castle itself. Fairy tales rarely send their characters somewhere comfortable when transformation is about to happen. Alice falls deep down the rabbit hole. Snow White enters the forest. Sleeping Beauty disappears behind a wall of thorns. And Beauty enters an enchanted castle. These places exist outside of ordinary reality because they are threshold spaces. Psychologically, we can think of them as the unconscious mind. You enter them when the normal identity no longer has all the answers. And once Beauty crosses the threshold of the castle, ordinary rules disappear. Objects speak, rooms seem alive, time feels strange, and the impossible becomes possible. In Disney's version, even the household objects have personalities of their own. And whether we interpret that psychologically, mythologically, or simply as wonderful storytelling, the message is similar. Beauty has entered another world. And this is where transformation happens. Not in the village, not where everything is familiar and comfortable, but in the unknown. And I think this is why so many myths begin when somebody leaves their home. Because transformation usually requires us to enter territory where the identity we've been relying upon no longer works. And then we come to one of the most famous symbols in the Disney version, the enchanted rose. The beast has until the final petal falls to learn how to love and be loved in return. The magical countdown belongs to the Disney adaptation rather than the earlier Beaumont tale, but the choice of a rose is fascinating because roses have carried symbolic associations with love, beauty, secrecy, mortality, and spiritual devotion across many different traditions. And within Beauty and the Beast, the rose becomes something even simpler. Time. The beast cannot remain unconscious forever. The petals are falling and there is urgency. And isn't that true for all of us? We can spend years defending ourselves, years blaming others and hiding behind an identity, years believing that the wound or trauma that we have is just simply who we are. But eventually life begins asking something of us. Will you stay inside the castle forever, or will you change? The rose reminds us that transformation isn't an abstract spiritual idea. We are living our lives while deciding whether to transform. The petals are always falling, but the choice is for us to make. But perhaps the most revealing symbol of all is the actual curse itself. Because the beast was not born a beast, he became one. And that makes his appearance symbolic rather than simply biological. Something happened. A human being became trapped inside a monstrous form. And doesn't trauma sometimes feel exactly like that? Something happens to us, sometimes in childhood, and gradually we construct protection around that wound or trauma. Sometimes we become colder or harder or more controlling, more withdrawn or reactive. Not because that is necessarily our deepest nature, but because somewhere along the way those behaviours helped us to survive something. And eventually the protection becomes an identity. We say to ourselves, I've always been like this, or I'm just an angry person. I don't trust anyone. I don't need anybody. This is just who I am. But underneath that protective structure, something else may still be waiting to be discovered. And this is where I think Beauty and the Beast becomes incredibly compassionate, because it asks us to consider the possibility that behaviour and essence are not always the same thing. That doesn't mean harmful behaviour should be excused. Definitely not. But understanding why something developed can help us actually transform it. Perhaps healing begins when we stop asking, what's wrong with me, and begin asking, what happened here? What is this behaviour protecting? What has been hidden underneath this for so long? And this brings us back to Psyche, because the ancient myth doesn't simply end when Psyche discovers Cupid. In many ways, that's where her journey actually begins. She loses him. She wanders and suffers and completes impossible tasks. And through those trials, Psyche herself changes. This is important because it prevents us from interpreting these stories only through the transformation of the masculine figure. Psyche transforms and beauty transforms too. The woman entering the mysterious castle isn't merely there to rescue somebody else. She is undergoing initiation. She must learn discernment and courage, trust and choice. And eventually she emerges as someone different from the woman who entered. So perhaps Beauty and the Beast is not actually a story in which beauty saves the beast. perhaps they reveal one another. The beast encounters his humanity, and beauty encounters her courage. Both identities change and grow through the relationship. Then Disney adds another character who makes the symbolism even richer, Gaston. Because strangely, Gaston looks human while behaving increasingly like a beast. The beast looks monstrous while gradually becoming more human. The reversal is brilliant. Gaston is handsome, admired by all the young women in the village. He's confident and socially accepted by everyone. He looks exactly like the kind of man the village believes Belle should want. But underneath the attractive exterior is entitlement, domination, vanity, and even violence. While the beast initially appears terrifying, beneath his frightening exterior there is an undeveloped capacity for love. And suddenly the fairy tale turns our normal way of judging people upside down. The handsome man may contain the monster, and the monster may contain the wounded man. Appearance tells us almost nothing, and perhaps that is one of the oldest lessons in fairy tales. We shouldn't judge a book by its cover, because the outer world deceives, and you must learn another kind of seeing. So when we bring all of this back into our own lives, I don't think Beauty and the Beast is asking us to find wounded people and rescue them. I think it is asking something much more uncomfortable. Where is the beast within us? What qualities have we pushed so deeply into the castle that we no longer recognize them as our own? Maybe you were like me and thought that anger was unacceptable, so you became endlessly accommodating and people-pleasing. Maybe you learned that wanting money was selfish, so you rejected and hid your ambition from others. Maybe you learned that powerful women were dangerous, so you made yourself small. Maybe sensitivity was mocked, so you built armor around it and act like you're so much tougher than you really are. And perhaps you were hurt so deeply that independence became the castle you now live inside. These things don't disappear when we reject them. They become enchanted, frozen in time, waiting. And this is where beauty enters, not as another person who comes to rescue us, but as our own capacity for compassionate awareness. The part of us willing to walk into the castle carrying a lamp and looking at ourselves honestly. The part of us willing to say, I see you. I see why you developed and I understand what you have been protecting, but you don't have to run my life anymore. What if this is what breaks the curse? Not perfection or destroying the darkness or destroying the monster, but wholeness. Maybe this is why stories like Beauty and the Beast keep returning. Ancient Greece and Rome gave us Psyche entering the mysterious palace of Cupid. 18th century France gave us Beauty entering the castle of the Beast. Disney gave us Belle, the enchanted rose, Gaston, and a castle filled with living objects. The details change, but something underneath remains strangely familiar. A human being crosses a threshold. There is something frightening waiting on the other side. Appearances prove deceptive, and love requires discernment. And then the hidden self is revealed. And eventually, something that appeared monstrous becomes transformed. I believe these stories endure because they remind us of something we instinctively know. There are rooms inside of ourselves that we would rather not enter. There are memories that we don't want to revisit. And there are emotions that we label unspiritual. There are qualities we hide because somewhere along the way we decided that they made us unlovable. But healing may not come from abandoning those parts of ourselves. It may come from finally meeting them consciously. Perhaps the real happily ever after isn't when Beauty discovers that the Beast was secretly a prince. Maybe it is the moment the Beast no longer needs to hide behind the monster. That is the deeper transformation. The rejected becomes recognized. The unconscious becomes conscious. The fragmented becomes whole again. And something that has been living in the darkness finally returns to the light. Maybe Beauty and the Beast was never simply teaching us to look beyond physical appearances. Maybe it was asking us to look beyond our own appearances as well, beyond the person that we think we are and who we present to the world, beyond the wounds, defenses, and identities that we've accumulated along the way. I think this is one of the most important questions we can ever ask ourselves. What part of me have I mistaken for a monster? Simply because I never learned how to love it and accept it. I think that is the hidden wisdom inside Beauty and the Beast. Thank you so much for listening and exploring this hidden wisdom with me. I'd love to know what part of the story spoke to you most deeply, and whether you see the Beast, the shadow, or even Belle a little bit differently now. In the next episode, we're going to step into another beloved story and uncover the deeper symbolism hidden within The Wizard of Oz. From the yellow brick road and the Emerald City to Dorothy's journey home, and what this strange, magical adventure may really be saying about the path of self-discovery. Until then, thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next episode.